In the spring of 1994, a tannery foreman named Royce Falk stood at the wire fence behind the Boone County Tannery, looked at the man who had been hauling away their cutting floor waste for nothing, and told him he was a fool to want it. The scraps were trash. They were the curl and the trim and the offcut. Nobody downstream would buy the pieces too small and too odd-shaped for a wallet panel or a belt blank, and Falk had been paying a contractor good money to truck them to the county landfill. The man at the fence, a small operation farmer named Emmett Reese, had offered to take the whole stream off his hands. Falk thought it was the easiest deal he had ever made, and he was not wrong about that part. He was wrong about almost everything else. 20 years later, in the fall of 2015, a buyer for a regional outfitter chain sat across a plank table from Emmett Reese and slid a single purchase order across the wood. The number on that order for one season of work boots stitched and lasted on a converted dairy floor was $410,000. Royce Falk was in the room that day. He had driven 2 hours to be there. The span between those two moments is 11 years of leather piling against a fence, and then 10 more of a man learning to do something with it that nobody had taught him. And this is the story of that span and of the two kinds of knowledge that collided across it. Let me tell you about Emmett Reese, because the foreman's reading of him was the reading most people made. He was 51 years old in 1994, a lean and quiet man who farmed 160 acres of mixed ground in the river-bottom country south of the Tannery, a little corn, a little hay, a small herd of beef cattle. He ran on the back 40. He was known in the county for 2 things. He never raised his voice, and he could fix anything made of a hide. His father had been a harness man back when harness still mattered, and his grandfather before that had tanned deer and cattle skins in a pit behind the same farmhouse Emmett still lived in. The knowledge had come down to him the way water comes down a hill, slowly and by gravity, without anybody deciding. It should. He knew leather the way some men know weather. He could put his hand flat on a piece of hide and tell you whether it had been rushed in the drum or given its time, whether the grain would hold a stitch or split under it, whether it would last 40 years on a working foot or crack in 2 winters. The tannery sat 4 miles up the road, a big operation by county standards, drum tanning sides for the furniture and automotive trade, turning out clean rectangular panels by the thousand. Emmett had bought scrap from them, now and again over the years, small lots for harness repair and the odd pair of chaps. In the winter of 1994, he asked Royce Falk a different question. He asked what the tannery did with everything that came off the cutting floor, the trim and the curl and the bellies, and the necks too irregular to template. Falk told him they paid to bury it, 40 cents a pound to a hauler, hundreds of pounds a week after week, a line item the plant manager had been complaining about for years. Emmett offered to take it all. He would bring his own trailer. He would haul it himself. He asked for nothing but the right to back up to the loading dock on Thursdays. Falk laughed and said yes, and that was the moment the deal was struck. And it is worth slowing down on it because everything that followed grew out of that handshake to the tannery. The scrap was a cost. It was negative value, money walking out the gate to the landfill. To Emmett Reese, it was something else entirely. He was not a sentimental man, and he did not think of it as treasure. He thought of it as raw material with a problem, and he had spent his whole life solving the particular problem that leather presents, which is that it is never uniform and never the same twice. And the trick is not to fight that, but to read it. The cutting floor waste of a tannery is the most varied leather. Every piece is a different thickness, a different temper, a different part of the animal. A factory cannot use it because a factory needs sameness. Emmett did not need sameness. He needed eyes and time, and he had both. Royce Falk was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that early because the easy version of this story makes him a villain, and he was not. He was a competent industrial leatherman who had spent 30 years inside a system that rewarded throughput, and that system had taught him a true thing that happened also to be a trap. It had taught him that value lived in the grade of the hide and the size of the usable panel, that a piece of leather you could not run through a clicker press in a clean stroke was a piece of leather worth nothing. By the only measure his world used, he was correct. The scraps were worthless. They were worthless the way a language is worthless to a man who cannot read it. For the first 2 years, Emmett did almost nothing with the leather but sort it. Let me tell you about the sorting, because it is the foundation of everything, and most people would have skipped it. The trailer would come back on Thursday afternoons, heaped with a tangle of offcuts, and Emmett would spread them on the long bench in the old milking parlor he had emptied of stalls, and he would go through them one piece at a time. He sorted by thickness first, splitting the heavy shoulder leather from the soft belly, running each piece between thumb and forefinger to feel the substance of it. He sorted by temper second the firm pieces that would hold a heel counter shape apart from the supple pieces that would take the curve of a vamp. He sorted by grain last, setting aside the tight, clean grain for anything that would show and the looser stuff for linings and hidden parts. By the end of the first winter, he had a parlor full of leather, organized into a taxonomy nobody had taught him, because nobody else had ever needed it. The factory threw it all in one bin, because to the factory it was all the same kind of nothing. Emmett saw 20 kinds of something. His wife, Della, thought he had lost his sense for a while, and she was not shy about saying so. They were not rich people. 160 acres of river bottom does not make anybody rich, and the cattle barely paid for themselves most years. And here was her husband spending his evenings sorting garbage into piles in a cold parlor, while the actual farm waited. She told him so at the kitchen table more than once, in the plain way of a woman who had carried her share of the place for 30 years. He told her to give him time. He always told her to give him time. It was the only argument he ever really made for anything. Now, if you have ever watched somebody pour years into a thing the world has told them is foolish, I would be glad to hear about it later. For now, stay with me, because the leather is about to start becoming something. In 1996, Emmett made his first boot. He had made shoes before, rough ones, the way a harness man learns to, but he had never tried to build a real lasted work boot, the kind a man stands in for 10 hours on concrete or in a furrow. He took a pair of his own worn-out boots, apart at the kitchen table every stitch, and laid the pieces flat, and understood for the first time how many separate panels go into one boot, and how each one does a different job. The outsole leather had to be dense and firm to wear against the ground. The insole had to be substantial enough to hold the stitching that anchored everything. The vamp, the part over the top of the foot, had to be supple enough to flex 10,000 times a day without cracking. The counter, the stiff cup around the heel, had to hold its shape under a man's full weight. The lining had to be soft and breathable against the skin. 5 different jobs, 5 different leathers, and the Tannery had been throwing away examples of every single one of them, mixed together in a bin, for 2 years. Let me tell you what made this work. Because this is the mechanism, and the mechanism is the whole thing. A factory boot is cut from 1 or 2 grades of leather bought in bulk, and the manufacturer accepts that some panels will be overbuilt and some underbuilt, because sorting every panel to its job would cost more than the boot is worth. The factory optimizes for cost and consistency, and it gets a boot that is adequate everywhere and excellent nowhere. Emmett did the opposite. Because his leather had cost him nothing but his Thursdays, he could afford to be ruinously particular. He could spend 20 minutes choosing the one piece of dense shoulder in the whole pile that was exactly right for an outsole, and another 20 finding the belly leather supple enough for a vamp that would never crack, and he could match each panel of each boot to the precise demand that panel would face for the next 40 years. No factory on earth could afford to do that. He could afford nothing else. The first boot took him 3 weeks, and it was ugly. The stitching wandered, the heel sat crooked, the toe was lumped where he had skived the leather unevenly. He put it on his own foot anyway, and walked the farm in it. One boot, his old one on the other foot, for a month, and at the end of the month, the new boot had broken in soft and true, and shown no crack and no separation, and the old factory boot had worn a hole through the lining at the heel. He held the 2 boots side by side on the bench under the lamp, and looked a long time at the difference, the ugly one whole and the bought one failing. And he understood that the failure point in a boot was never the leather if you chose the leather right. He made a second pair, better, the stitching truer and the toe clean. Then a third, better still. By 1998, he was making a pair a week that he was not ashamed of, and he gave them away to his brother, to a neighbor who ran a dairy, to the man who delivered his feed. He told each of them the same thing. Wear these hard and tell me where they fail. That was the whole research program, and it ran for 4 years. Let me tell you about the foil in this story. Now, because his path runs alongside Emmett's the whole way, and the 2 of them make the shape of the thing clear. His name was Garrett Pohl, and he farmed the place adjoining Emmett's to the east, 240 acres, a younger man by a decade, and a more ambitious one. In the late 90s, Garrett looked at the commodity grain market and the low cattle prices, and made the decision that the agricultural press and the extension office and every loan officer in the region were all telling farmers to make. He got big. He borrowed against his land to buy more land, took the home place from 240 acres to nearly 1,000, financed a line of new equipment, a combine that cost more than Emmett's entire farm was worth, and committed the whole operation to corn and soybeans at scale. It was the smart play. Everyone said so. For a while, it looked like genius. Emmett, meanwhile, was making boots 1 pair a week in a cold parlor and giving most of them away, and to the county the contrast could not have been plainer. Garrett Pohl was the future, and Emmett Reese was a man playing with garbage. When the 2 of them passed on the road, Garrett would lift 2 fingers off the wheel in the country wave, friendly enough, and there was pity in it. Della felt the pity more than Emmett did. Emmett did not seem to feel it at all. He was busy. He had found the failure point. The boots his testers brought back, after a year of hard wear, had begun to fail in one consistent place, and it was not the leather. The leather was holding. The boots were coming apart at the welt, the strip of leather that joins the upper to the sole and carries the stitching that holds the whole boot together. Emmett had been gluing and nailing his soles the way a repairman does, and a glued sole on a hard-worked boot lets go inside 2 years, no matter how good the leather is. So, in 1999, Emmett taught himself the hardest thing in the trade, which is the hand welt, the Goodyear weld done by hand, a method most of the industry had abandoned to machines a century before, and most of the rest had abandoned altogether. Let me tell you what a welt is, because it is the reason these boots would outlive the men who bought them. And a welted boot is built around a strip of leather. The welt that is stitched first to the upper and the insole, running all the way around the boot, and then the outsole is stitched to that welt. The genius of it is that the sole is held on by a line of stitching that never touches the upper, which means when the sole wears out, and a working sole always wears out, you can cut the stitches and stitch on a new sole without disturbing the rest of the boot. A welted boot can be resoled 5 times, 6 times, indefinitely. The boot becomes a frame that lasts a lifetime, and the sole becomes the only consumable. A glued boot, when the sole goes, is trash. A welted boot, when the sole goes, is a trip to a man with an awl. It is the difference between a thing you replace and a thing you keep. Emmett spent the better part of a year ruining leather and breaking needles before his hands learned the welt, and when they learned it, he had everything he needed. Good leather, sorted, to its job and a method of construction that made the boot effectively permanent. He did not know yet what he had. He only knew the boots stopped coming back. By 2002, the boots were not coming back at all, and people had started asking to buy them. Not many. A dairy hand here, a fence contractor there. Men who stood on their feet all day and had noticed that the man next to them was wearing a boot that did not wear out. Emmett charged them what the leather and his time were worth, which, because the leather was free, came to a price that undercut the good factory boots while lasting 3 times as long. He sold maybe 40 pairs that year out of the parlor by word of mouth, with no name on them at all. Men drove out from 2 counties over because somebody at a livestock auction had told them about a boot that did not wear out, and they sat on the bench while Emmett traced their feet on butcher paper and asked them what they did all day and on what kind of ground, because a boot for concrete and a boot for furrow were not the same boot. Della kept the books in a school notebook, a column of names and a column of figures in her tight, careful hand. They cleared a little over $6,000, which was more than the cattle had made, and for the first time in 8 years, she stopped saying anything at the kitchen table about garbage. She did not say he had been right, either. She just stopped saying he was wrong, which from Della was the same thing. Let me tell you about the granddaughter now, because she is the one who turns this from a man's stubborn hobby into something that outlives him. Her name was Nora, Emmett, and Della's son's girl, and in 2008 she came back to the county at 24 with a business degree and a job offer in a city she had not yet accepted. She loved her grandfather, and she was embarrassed by him in the specific way that educated young people are embarrassed by elders who do things the slow, wrong way. She looked at the operation with the eyes the world had trained into her, and what she saw was a man with no brand, no margins anybody had calculated, no marketing, no incorporation, no distribution, selling a premium product for less than it was worth out of a barn because he had never thought to do otherwise. She told him so. She was gentle about it, but she was clear. He was leaving money on the table. He had no idea what he had. "You have something here," she told him, standing in the parlor with a finished boot in her hands, "but you are doing it like a hobby." She used the word hobby. It landed the way it always lands in this country, soft and dismissive, the word the credentialed world reaches for when it sees value it cannot account for. Emmett did not argue. He handed her another boot and told her to wear it for a year and then tell him it was a hobby. She took the boot. That was the beginning of her conversion, though neither of them knew it. She wore the boot through a city winter and a country summer, and she paid attention the way she had been trained to. and at the end of the year the boot had molded to her foot and shown no wear worth naming, and she had started, without meaning to do the arithmetic. A factory work boot of comparable leather sold for $200 and lasted 2 years, and could not be resold. Her grandfather's boot would last, on the evidence of her own foot, the better part of a decade, and could be resold indefinitely for $30 a time. She had been taught to find the margin, and she found it. The margin was not in making the boot cheaper. The margin was in the truth that her grandfather had been selling a 40-year boot at a 2-year price, because he priced by what the leather cost him, and the leather cost him nothing. Nora did not take the city job. She told her parents she was staying to help her grandfather, and her father, Emmett's son, who had left the farm precisely because he could not see a future in it, thought she had lost her mind, the way her grandmother had once thought Emmett had lost his. The pity that had once landed on Emmett landed now on Nora, too, a girl with a degree, throwing it away on her grandfather's garbage boots. Let me tell you about the foil again, because by now the divergence the whole county would feel was already underway, though nobody could see it yet. Garrett Pohl in 2008 was the most successful farmer in that part of the county, and he was also, though it was invisible from the road, the most fragile. His 1,000 acres were planted fence to fence in 2 crops. His debt service ran to figures Emmett could not have comprehended. His whole operation was a single bet, beautifully executed, that grain prices would stay high, and the weather would behave, and the interest on his loans would stay where it was. It was the bet the entire industrial model of farming had made, the bet that you could optimize a system to peak efficiency by stripping out everything that did not contribute to maximum yield, the redundancy, the diversity, the slack. An efficient system is a profitable system right up until the moment it isn't, because the same thing that makes it efficient, the absence of slack, is the thing that makes it unable to absorb a shock. Garrett had built a magnificent machine, with no give in it anywhere. Emmett had built the opposite, almost by accident, a little diversified operation that made grain and hay and cattle and now boots, where no single failure could take down the whole, financed by nothing, owing nobody. Nora spent 2009 and 2010 building the thing her grandfather could not. She incorporated. She gave the boots a name, which I will not put in your mouth here because the name is not the point. And she set a price that reflected what the boot actually was, more than triple what Emmett had been charging. And to everyone's surprise, except hers, the boots sold faster at the higher price than they had at the lower one. Because a price is information, and the old price had been telling people the boot was cheap. She found a leather chemist at the State Agricultural College, a careful older woman named Iris Vance, and brought her out to look at what Emmett was doing, half hoping for validation and half braced for the expert to confirm the family's old fear. Iris Vance walked the parlor for an hour, handling the sorted leather, examining the hand welts under a loupe, saying almost nothing. She picked up pieces from the temper piles and bent them, watched how they recovered, set them down in the exact spots Emmett had set them. She took a finished boot to the window and turned it in the light and ran her thumb along the welt stitching the way a person checks, a thing they cannot quite believe. Once she stopped and asked Emmett to hand her 2 pieces of belly leather that looked, to Nora's eye, identical, and she asked him which one he would use for a vamp and why, and Emmett took the one on the left and said the other had a stretch in it that would let go at the flex point inside 5 years. And Iris Vance held both pieces up to the light and was quiet for a moment, then said he was right and that she could not have told them apart without a tensile rig. Then she asked Emmett one question. She asked him where he had learned to sort temper by hand, because the equipment her department used to measure what he was measuring cost $90,000, and he was doing it with his thumb. Emmett said his father had taught him. Iris Vance nodded slowly and said that was a shame, because his father was dead and the knowledge was going to die with men like him, and somebody ought to write it down. That was the day Nora understood what she was actually sitting on. Not a boot company, a repository. Her grandfather's hands held a way of reading leather that the instruments of the agricultural college could approximate only at great cost, and that knowledge had no owner and no record, and would vanish when his hand stopped. She began that winter to write it down. She sat with him in the parlor through the evenings with a notebook, the way he had once sat sorting alone, and she made him say out loud the things his hands knew silently, and most of the time he could not, because the knowledge was not in words, it was in the thumb and the eye. So she changed her method. She stopped asking him to explain, and started asking him to show her, piece by piece, this one or that one, why this belly, and not that one for a vamp, and slowly, the silent taxonomy of the parlor began to become a written one, a journal of leather, the first the family had ever kept. Now let me tell you what happened to the weather and the markets, because the structural shock that settles the story arrived in two parts, and it did not care at all what anybody believed. The first part was the drought. The summer of 2012 was the driest that country had seen in 50 years. The corn came up and then stood still, and then began to die, standing leaf by leaf across the whole region. For an operation like Garrett Pole's, planted fence to fence, in corn and soybeans with every acre leveraged, a drought of that size was not a bad year. It was a structural event. The crop he had borrowed against did not come in. The yield on his 1,000 acres fell by more than half, and the half that came in hit a market that had also been hammered, and the payment on the combine and the land notes came due on schedule, because debt does not observe the weather. Garrett did everything right and everything competent, and it did not matter because he had built a machine with no slack, and the drought was a demand for slack he did not have. Emmett's 160 acres burned in the same drought. His corn died, too. His corn was only a small part of a diversified place, though, and his cattle he sold down early when he read the summer coming, the way his grandfather had taught him to read a dry sky, and his hay he had put up in the wet spring of the year before and held in the barn against exactly this. The drought cost Emmett a season's corn, and inconvenience. It cost Garrett the foundation of everything. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to tell this part with satisfaction, and that would be a betrayal of what actually happened. There was no satisfaction in it. Garrett Pole was a good farmer and a good neighbor who had followed the best advice his world had to offer, the advice of the extension agents and the loan officers and the agricultural economists, all of whom were sincere and educated and wrong about the one thing that mattered, which was that the efficiency they preached was a hidden fragility. When Garrett's operation began to come apart in the fall of 2012, Emmett did not gloat. He drove over and helped him load cattle. That is the kind of man he was. And it is the kind of man the story needs him to be, because the point was never that Garrett was foolish. The point was that the whole system Garrett trusted was built to break exactly the way it broke, and almost nobody could see it until it did. The second part of the shock was slower, and it cut the other way. As the regional farm economy contracted through 2013 and 2014, something happened to the market for honest goods that always happens in a downturn, though the experts never predict it. People stopped buying things that wore out. A man who was not sure about next year, does not buy a $200 boot that will be trash in 2 years. He buys, if he can find it, the boot that will last him 10 and can be fixed when it wears. Word of Emmett's boots, which had spread by the foot for 15 years, began to spread faster, because in a hard time the value proposition that had always been true became suddenly legible to everyone. The boot that could be resoled forever was not a luxury in a downturn. It was the only sensible purchase a careful man could make. Which brings us to the fall of 2015 and the plank table and the number. Nora had been selling the boots regionally for 5 years, by then a few hundred pairs a season, building slowly, refusing every offer to scale up faster than the leather supply and her grandfather's training of new hands would allow. She had taken on 2 apprentices, local men, and her grandfather was teaching them the welt and the sort, the way his father had taught him. Except now it was being written down as it was taught. A buyer named Dale Krueger, who purchased for a chain of regional farm and ranch outfitters across 4 states, had been wearing a pair of the boots for 2 years, bought retail, not knowing or caring who made them, until the day he noticed the man across the counter at a sale barn wearing the same distinctive welt and asked where they came from. He traced them back through 3 owners and a feed store clerk before the trail led to a converted dairy floor south of the river. He drove out to the place that had been a milking parlor, expecting a small factory, and finding instead an old man at a long bench under a single lamp, sorting leather 1 piece at a time into piles that meant nothing to Kruger and everything to Emmett. He watched Emmett sort for an hour without understanding what he was watching, only that the man's hands never hesitated and never went back to a piece twice. He watched a welt go in by hand, the awl and the waxed thread, and the slow, even pull, and he counted, idly, how long 1 boot took, and the number alarmed him, because no operation that built a boot that slowly should have been able to fill a single store. Then he picked up a finished pair and felt the weight of them and bent the vamp and looked at the welt that meant the sole could be replaced forever, and he stopped thinking about how slow it was. He sat down at the plank table and made an offer for a full season's production for his stores. Nora had asked Royce Falk to be there. This was her doing, and it was a generous one because she could have left him out of it entirely. Falk was retired by then, the tannery sold to a larger concern, and the cutting floor scrap long since going to some other arrangement, and he was an old man who had spent his career certain that the trim was trash. Nora had found him through the family of a former tannery worker and invited him to come see what had been done with 11 years of his garbage. Not to humiliate him, she was clear with him on the phone about that, but because she thought he had a right to know and because she suspected. Dale Krueger slid the purchase order across the plank table. Nobody spoke. Emmett, who did not read business documents as a rule and left all of that to his granddaughter, looked at it anyway because Nora put it in front of him. $410,000, 1 season, 1 purchase order, from leather that a tannery had paid 40 cents a pound to bury. The number sat on the table and nobody reached for it. Della, who was 72 now and had kept the books in a school notebook for 20 years, put her hand flat on the wood. Nora watched her grandfather's face and saw nothing change in it, because nothing ever did, and understood that to him the number was not the point and never had been the boots with a point. The number was just the world finally agreeing. It landed hardest in that quiet room on the one man who had measured the leather and found it worthless. Royce Falk sat very still and looked at the order, and then looked at the sorted leather stacked along the parlor wall, the same trim he had trucked to the landfill for 40 cents a pound, and the arithmetic of 30 years of his own certainty rearranged itself in front of him. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he asked Emmett the only question that mattered, the same question almost that Iris Vance had asked 6 years before. He asked how a man could look at that bin of scrap and see this. And Emmett, who never made speeches, gave him the only answer he had, which was that he had not seen this. He had only seen leather and asked it what it wanted to be, and the leather had told him the way it always would if a man was willing to spend the years it took to learn the language. Falk nodded. He was not a man given to large gestures, but before he left that day he asked Emmett, plainly, whether he might come back sometime and watch him sort. He wanted, at the end of his life, to learn to read the thing he had spent it throwing away. Emmett told him to come on Thursdays. Let me tell you what they did with the money, because what a person does after the number is the truest thing about them. They did not scale up to meet the whole order at once, because the leather would not allow it, and because Emmett would not allow the leather to be the wrong leather, just to fill an order. They filled what they could fill right, and they told Dale Kruger the truth about the rest. That good boots come at the speed of good leather, and no faster. And Kruger, who had been buying mass-produced goods his whole career and had forgotten there was another way, took the smaller honest number over the larger dishonest one, because by then he understood what he was buying. They paid off nothing, because they owed nothing. They put the money into the one thing that could not be bought, which was more hands trained in the sort and the wealth. Within 3 years, there were 6 apprentices on the dairy floor, then 9, all of them local. Several of them young people who, like Nora, had been about to leave the county for good, and now had a reason to stay. And they bought Garrett Pole's debt. This is the part Della insisted on and Emmett agreed to without a word, the way he agreed to the few things that mattered. Garrett had lost most of his 1,000 acres in the unwinding after the drought, sold off in pieces to cover the notes, and was down to the original home quarter and a foreclosure clock he could not beat. Emmett and Nora bought the note from the bank at the bank's discount and held it at terms Garrett could meet, and asked for nothing but that he stay on the land. It was not charity, and Emmett would have been offended to hear it called that. It was the simple recognition that a good neighbor had been broken by bad advice, and that the people who had been proven right had no business letting the people who had been proven wrong go under, because the difference between them had never been virtue. It had been a kind of knowledge, and knowledge is meant to be shared, not hoarded as a verdict. The journal Nora started in that cold parlor became, over the next decade, the thing Iris Vance had said somebody ought to make. It grew into a real record. The temper grades and the grain reads and the welt method and the sort, all of it written down in plain language, with Emmett's own examples pressed and labeled beside the descriptions, the silent knowledge of 3 generations of his family, finally given a form that could outlive a pair of hands. The agricultural college took a copy for its archive. The apprentices each kept their own. The knowledge that Iris Vance had feared would die with men like Emmett did not die. It was the realest inheritance the family had, worth more than the deed to the river bottom, and unlike the deed, it could be copied without being divided. Emmett Reese kept sorting leather on Thursdays until he was past 80. Royce Falk came out and watched him do it more than a few times in those last years. The 2 old men at the long bench in the lamplight, one of them learning, at the end of his life, to read what the other had read all along. When Emmett died, the dairy floor did not go quiet. Nora ran it, and the 9 apprentices became 12, and the boots went out into the world built the same way. Leather sorted to its job by a hand that had been taught by a hand that had been taught by Emmett, and the welt holding, and the sole resolable. at every boot a small argument against the idea that the only things worth anything are the things a system already knows how to count. Here's the thing the whole story comes down to, and I will say it plainly because it has earned the right to be said. There are two kinds of knowledge in this world. There is the wide, shallow, confident kind, the kind that comes with a degree and an instrument and a model, the kind that can tell you the average and the grade and the throughput, the kind that built Garrett Pohl's magnificent fragile machine and told Royce Falk, "It is real knowledge and it is not to be despised." There is another kind, though, narrow and deep and patient, the kind that lives in a thumb and an eye and 40 years of Thursdays, the kind that knows not the average piece of leather, but this piece in this hand right now and what it wants to become. The first kind measures what is easy to count and mistakes it for everything. The second kind attends to what is actually there. A tannery measured 11 years of leather and counted it as nothing, because nothing was all its instruments could see. A man with his father's eye measured the same leather and counted it as the work of the rest of his life. The scraps were never trash. They were only waiting for someone who could read them.